I think that it is extremely unlikely that Russia would use nuclear weapons unless it was losing on the battlefield. In the beginning of the war in 2022, I think that the United States thought that it could deliver a significant defeat to Russia and knock it out of the ranks of the great powers. In the year 2022, because the Russian army was then in poor shape, relatively poor shape, and the Ukrainian military was doing very well on the battlefield, we thought that we could defeat the Russians on the battlefield inside of Ukraine. That's number one. And number two, as you all remember, we thought that economic sanctions would bring the Russians to their knees. We would deliver these devastating sanctions that would cripple the Russian economy. And that, coupled with the defeats on the battlefield, would effectively knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. Had that happened, I think the Russians would have probably used nuclear weapons in Ukraine to rescue the situation. And you all want to remember that if Russia were to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, it would not have to fear nuclear retaliation because Ukraine has no nuclear weapons of its own. And there is no way the West would use its nuclear weapons to defend Ukraine. So in a situation where the Russians were backed into a corner, were facing a defeat that was going to knock them out of the ranks of the great powers, I think in that circumstances, it's highly likely they would turn to nuclear weapons. Now, the good news is that's not going to happen. And the reason is that the Russians are winning the war on the battlefield. And the situation is deteriorating for the Ukrainians and for the West. This is why I would argue that the Ukrainians should cut a deal now. Because they're going to just lose more territory and more Ukrainians are going to die if they continue the war. And the reason is that the Russians are winning. If you look at the balance of manpower, the balance of artillery, the balance of air power, it's manifestly clear that the Russians are in the driver's seat. And if you take into account the fact that President Trump wants to withdraw significant support for Ukraine, that means that Ukraine is going to lose its principal patron. And it was losing even when Joe Biden was in the White House. You can imagine how bad the situation is going to get if Donald Trump refuses to put more weaponry and more money into the Biden pipeline. So Ukraine is doomed. It's not like Ukraine is going to go down to decisive defeat. There's going to end up being a dysfunctional rump state. Ukraine is going to continue to exist, but it'll be a dysfunctional rump state. All of this is a long way of saying that given that the Russians are winning, there's no incentive for them to use nuclear weapons. And that is good news. But the fact that the Ukrainians are losing is obviously bad news from Ukraine's point of view. I think that the principal reason that Europe has been able to pursue, or let me put it differently, European states have been able to pursue a liberal foreign policy, which I think is most clearly reflected in the European Union, was because of the presence of the American military in Europe. In other words, it was NATO that provided the underpinning of the European Union. And one of the reasons almost all European leaders I have met since the Cold War ended in 1989 have been deeply committed to keeping the Americans in Europe is because they understand that the United States is the pacifier. This is the American pacifier. To put it in slightly different terms, NATO is the pacifier. NATO underpins the European Union. The reason that the European Union is so tightly knit, and it is tightly knit, it's a remarkable institution, right? The reason it is able to reach that point of unity, the reason that we can talk about Europe, just think about the use of that word Europe. We talk about Europe as if it were a single state. Of course, it's not, as you remind us. But we talk about Europe as if it's a single state is because of the European Union. But again, you never want to forget that underpinning the EU, underpinning Europe, is the American pacifier, NATO. Now you have to ask yourself, where is the Trump administration headed with regard to the American commitment to Europe? As you know, Trump has contempt for the Europeans. Trump does not like Europeans, the Hungarians notwithstanding. And Trump would like to greatly reduce the American military footprint in Europe, right? And I believe if Trump was free to act, he would put an end to the American commitment to NATO, right? And you also want to remember that the rise of China and the fact that China is a peer competitor creates the famous pivot to Asia. And you all know that if you pivot to some place, you pivot away from another place. So pivoting to Asia means, in good part, pivoting from Europe. That has not happened yet because of the Ukraine war. But if that were to happen, if Trump gets his way and we greatly reduce the American commitment to Europe, the American footprint in Europe, and here we're talking about the military footprint, that will have significant consequences for the European Union and for that concept of Europe. And I think what's going to happen here over time is the Americans are going to reduce their presence in Europe. And I think you're going to see centrifugal forces that are already at play inside of Europe accelerate. And I believe over time, more countries in Europe will look like Hungary. More countries in Europe will think in terms of the national interest, and they'll think less in terms of being part of an international community, less in terms of being part of Europe, and more nationalistic. So my bottom line is you do not want to underestimate the importance of the American military presence in Europe. You want to understand that NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, which starts in 1994, that's when the Clinton administration decides to expand NATO. 99 is the first tranche. That, of course, is when Hungary is brought in. 2004 is the second tranche. It was not aimed at containing Russia. It was aimed at spreading the Western liberal order that had sprouted up in the Western part of Europe during the Cold War towards the East. It was a very liberal foreign policy. And a number of realists argue, people like me, people like George Kennan, right, and numerous other people, including the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this is in the 1990s, that if you move NATO eastward, and especially if you went into Ukraine, the Russians were going to react. This was basic realist logic at play. And the fact is that the Clinton administration, the vast majority of Europeans, refused to accept that logic. They thought about the world in very liberal terms. This is one of the principal reasons that most Europeans today and most Americans today fail to appreciate the fact that Russia sees NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat. Any good realist would understand axiomatically that if you take a military alliance that was a mortal enemy of the Soviet Union during the Cold War and you march it up to Russia's doorstep, the Russians are going to be scared. They're going to be really scared and they're going to react. That's a realist world view at play. But Europe was dominated by liberals, as was the United States. This is a different way of thinking about international politics. The balance of power is largely irrelevant now. We don't have to worry about that. What we want to do is spread institutions like the EU and NATO eastward. We want to spread democracy eastward. We want to spread economic independence. We want to get the East Europeans hooked on capitalism and so forth and so on. And the end result is we'll all live happily ever after. Well, it didn't work out very well. And you now have a situation in Europe where I believe that, except for places like Hungary, where there are realists and a few other small enclaves in Europe, I think liberal thinking about international politics and liberal thinking about Ukraine still dominates. And the end result is we have gotten ourselves, and we are now in deep trouble because we didn't think like good realists.